I'm Christine Blow, and I'm really delighted to be able to chair this panel. I'm going to introduce the speakers as they speak, and we start with Dan Kowalik, and I'm sure that a number of you know a lot about him, but the thing that I'm going to tell you about is that he was a lawyer for the United Steelworkers, and at the United Steelworkers he worked on alien tort claims cases against the Coca-Cola Company and Drummond and Occidental Petroleum cases arising from what my notes say, and it's absolutely true, egregious cases of human rights abuses in Colombia. The Christian Science Monitor, I'm sure a paper of record, referring to his work defending Colombian trade unionists under threat of assassination, described Mr. Kowalik as one of the most prominent defenders of Colombian workers in the United States. He's the recipient of a mentoring fellowship from Stanford University, and an all-round good guy. So the floor is yours.
Great.
Dan.
Thank you very much, and thank you. And thanks for coming out today. It's been a great day. I hope everyone got something out of it. It's great to see people getting together to show solidarity with Latin America, which for many of us is so near and dear to our hearts. It was a very eventful week, as I think some of you know, in terms of Latin America, and I wanted to talk about a couple things that happened. 2 days ago, you might have seen the Washington Post reported that an MIT study proved there was no fraud in the Bolivian election. They re-elected Evo Morales in the fall.
Yep.
So despite the fact that we had been told for months, and somehow right away, somehow miraculously people knew that there was fraud in the election, literally within 24 hours. We were told this by human rights groups, we were told this by the media, we were told this by our governments. Now the Washington Post is saying, oops, that wasn't true. He won, fair and square. But of course the damage is done. People have been killed, largely indigenous people, in Bolivia by state forces. The coup government has rolled back the progress of a number of years of Evo Morales' presidency. And it's unclear, what the path forward will be in Bolivia. But this is an example of how we are misled every day on events coming out of not only Latin America, other regions as well, but Latin America in particular. And a lot of times the propaganda is not as blatant as that, where you're told just an absolute lie. But sometimes the way the propaganda works, and I want to point this out to folks, is simply to emphasize certain events in the world over others, similar events, and treat them differently depending on where you want regime change. And let me give you an example of this. 2 days ago, it was also the 31st anniversary of the Caracazo in Venezuela. Can I just see a quick show of hands? The Caracazo, is that a name that rings a bell to people? Can I see some hands? Okay, a few, not a lot, right? And that's okay, that's good. You're helping me here. If I saw a lot, my whole point would be eviscerated. So, the Caracazo, first of all, before I get to that, it happened the same year as the Tiananmen Square massacre, 1989. Can I see a show of hands who knows about the Tiananmen Square massacre in China? Almost everyone, right? Now, here's the interesting fact. And if you go to Wikipedia or whatever, do a quick Google search, you'll see that it's estimated that in the Tiananmen Square massacre, between 300 and 3,000 people were killed. They're not certain how many, but there's an estimate, 300 to 3,000. Coincidentally, it's estimated that 300 to 3,000 people were killed in the Caracazo in Venezuela. Same number of people. Although, of course, at the time, China had 1 billion people, and Venezuela had about 25 million, right? So proportionally, the number is much higher. So the Caracazo, just to remind us, or for many of us to learn for the first time, was an event in which people rose up against IMF austerity measures imposed by the newly elected president, Venezuelan President Carlos Andrés Perez, who ran on a campaign that he would not impose IMF austerity measures. But he turned around and did just that within a few weeks of becoming president. The result was a rise in oil prices, which also led to a rise in food prices and transportation prices. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back. And he had mass unrest amongst the poor in Caracas, Caracazo coming from the word Caracas, but also in other cities. The response from the new president was to suspend the Constitution and to unleash the police and military forces upon the population, and those forces killed and in many cases disappeared hundreds to thousands of people. This was barely covered in the West. I don't remember it at the time. I didn't learn about the event until years later. And it's certainly not commemorated now. You might remember last year was the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, and you had huge commemorations in the media for like a week, right? There were no commemorations of the Caracazo, even though, as I mentioned, disproportionately the numbers killed were much huger than in China. Moreover, what happened in China as a result of Tiananmen Square? Not much. Business as usual continued. In fact, Deng Xiaoping accelerated the move towards capitalism, which in part were what the protests were about, because actually some of those people wanted to maintain socialism. Another fact that you're not told about. What happened in Venezuela? Hugo Chavez happened. The events of the Caracazo led directly to the rise of the movement that put Hugo Chavez in Miraflores, in the presidential palace in 1998. And he, according to Noam Chomsky, would lead the liberation of Latin America for the first time in 500 years. Not a small feat. So both in terms of the dead, the disproportionate death count, and the historical importance, the Caracazo, in my view, is a much more important historic event. But it is not one you're told about, not one that we commemorate. To me, this is an example of how our propaganda system works. To, again, in the words of Chomsky, manufacture consent towards supporting regime change in a place like Venezuela and China also, while not learning about, for example, Venezuela's next door neighbor, Colombia, where a social leader is murdered every single day, and where there are the most number of internally displaced people on earth, even more than in Syria. 8 million internally displaced people in Colombia. There's also, and I don't have much time left, 6 million Colombians who live in Venezuela, who fled Colombia and the violence there. But again, this is not a fact that the media deigns to keep us abreast of. And so what we see in conclusion is a media campaign against the progressive governments in Latin America, like that of Evo Morales, like that of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and of course, as always, Cuba. And we need to educate ourselves and to see how this propaganda system works so we can break through that system and teach others how it works so that we can defend those types of revolutions. Thank you very much.
Dan, thank you very much. And if you want to learn much more about all of the things that Dan knows, then please do come to the front and buy his book. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Mariela Cojon, whom I have known for quite a while now. I first met her when she was the driving force behind Justice for Colombia, and I've had the great privilege of going to Colombia with her a number of times. She then, following that great work in Colombia, was actually paid by the Norwegian government to be an advisor to the FARC during the peace negotiations and the peace process in Colombia. And one of the things about that process, and I'm sure that Mariela will say something about this, was the significance of women in the process, but also what it envisaged for women post the process. Mariela, I'm delighted to say, is now the Senior International Officer at the TUC and has made that organisation a much more activist and a much more focused organisation in terms of international work. And the TUC now has some priority countries, and two of them, Colombia and Brazil, are the ones about which I think Mariela's going to speak now. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, and thanks to Alborada for the invitation to speak. As Christine said, in the TUC and as a trade union movement, we've chosen some priority countries to focus on for international solidarity, as well as various other areas of work and thematic work. And why we chose Colombia and Brazil is because they're actually they're in the top 10 worst countries in the world for workers' rights. That's according to the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation's annual list where they document workers' abuses. Brazil is a recent addition. Colombia, unfortunately, has been a long-standing member of that unfortunate top 10. And really, Brazil and Colombia, as you all know, represent the kind of worst of the far right in Latin America and in the world. And from a union perspective, in terms of the history of the union movement's internationalism and solidarity, it's not just about solidarity one way, it's also what we can learn from those struggles. And increasingly here, I think we'll need to learn and take some of the lessons from our sisters and brothers there. In terms of Colombia, there's a 15, 16 years of history of the British trade union movement supporting Colombia. They set up Justice for Colombia. Unfortunately, Colombia is the world's worst place for trade unionists. Or about 2/3 of trade unionists murdered in the world are killed in Colombia. So last year, of 54 trade unionists killed worldwide, 34 were Colombian. Brazil is a more recent addition to our kind of focus. Since the parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff, the TUC began to speak out in support of our Brazilian trade union colleagues and civil society. We saw with the Temer administration huge anti-union labour reforms coming in, about 100 changes to the labour code, which made it more difficult for collective bargaining, which did all sorts of things to stop people organising. And obviously the imprisonment of former President Lula and the lawfare that was used in that case was something that alarmed the international trade union movement, as well as many other sectors of society, and we campaigned for his freedom. With the election of Bolsonaro, we felt we needed to up that work and build our relationship more with our sisters and brothers in Brazil. And really it's part of looking at it as, what happens to working people when the far right are in power. And we can see with Bolsonaro in power, it's not just trade unionists, it's women, it's indigenous, it's environmental activists, the misogyny and the homophobia and the racism that comes through that administration. And we're seeing concrete changes like the Minister for Women, an evangelical pastor who talks of, women practicing abstinence and of, blaming victims for rape, increasing killings of indigenous and environmental activists. And a report that came out yesterday, a human rights report, that said there's 16% increase in police killings just in Rio from the year before to last year. So we're thinking about what work we could do. We hosted Brazilian Visitor. We're going to take the first international trade union delegation in May to Brazil to meet with Lula, to go to the Amazon region, to see the impact of the destruction of the environment, and to try and build the campaign here to support Brazil. And I know Christine chairs the Brazil Solidarity Initiative, and we're working closely with that campaign as well. On Colombia, it's difficult to kind of speak in a short space of time. I was asked to speak on the peace process. Obviously, that's my personal experience, and it's in a very complicated and bleak place, I would say. When we started, when I was at Justice for Colombia, supporting the peace talks, it was right at the beginning of the talks, and what we did was take people from Ireland who'd been on both sides of the negotiating table to share their experiences with the FARC and with Colombian civil society. And as the agreement developed, and then when I started working directly in the talks, there was a lot of hope. We were never, I don't think, naive that the strength of opposition to the peace process from the Uribe camp, the former President Uribe, but I don't think many of us thought it would get to this place, the amount of effort that's been put into trying to destroy and dismantle that peace process. The agreement is a historic opportunity to finally target and try and solve some of those root causes of Colombia's conflicts. I think there's quite a lot of knowledge probably in this room about the causes of the conflict, but the agreement has a chapter specifically dedicated to land reform, to rural reform, which really deals with the inequality in Colombia, and it could deal with it if it was implemented. Colombia has some of the highest levels of inequality in Latin America and in the world, and really the government, even under the previous administration, but more so under the Duque administration, has not implemented that chapter in any way. So the millions of peasant farmers that need land titles, that need infrastructure, that need support in the countryside, are not seeing those changes made. And with the election of President Duque, who represents Uribe's political party, who led the campaign against the peace negotiations, it's been very difficult to see that implementation take place. When the talks started, it was a very different landscape in Latin America. Chavez was in power, Dilma was in power, you had Argentina, you had very progressive, powerful countries in the region, and obviously when the talks came to an end in 2016, that was a very different scenario. The other chapter of the agreement that's seen the least implementation is the chapter on political participation, which is the other root cause of the conflict in Colombia. It's the lack of democracy, the lack of space for people to organise. There was an entire political party wiped out in the 1980s. The last time the FARC tried to enter the political process, the Unión Patriótica party had 5,000 activists, including almost every elected congressman, 2 presidential candidates, assassinated. So that's the last experience of the FARC trying to enter the political process. And it was interesting because the Communist Party just 2 weeks ago presented their collective case to the Truth Commission, which is one of the parts of the peace process, and they've actually documented 180 laws and decrees that have been put in place in the last 130 years in Colombia that have been anti-communist and anti-insurgency kind of decrees and trying to criminalize the left. So there's a long history in Colombia of not allowing people to organize politically or in a union. And what we're seeing today is really a starving of resources for the peace agreement. So areas that need resources and investment, like the reincorporation of the over 14,000 former FARC combatants. Many of them have not been given the land projects that they were promised. Many of them are facing very dire situations economically, but also 187 FARC members have been assassinated. And that's huge when you think they laid down their weapons in good faith, they complied with their commitments, they handed in their weapons, they gave in their assets, they presented themselves to the truth and justice process, and almost 200 have been assassinated just in 3 years. That's as well as over 500 civil society activists killed just in 3 years since the signing of the peace agreement. So what we've seen is the regions that the FARC left, instead of the state, bringing in services and investment into those areas, other armed groups have taken control of those regions, and there's been, systematic attacks on human rights defenders, on environmental campaigners, on indigenous activists, women's activists, and the UN Human Rights Office just put out its annual report last week, and it's actually documented things that we're seeing, the dark days of the Uribe administration back, elements of that, of collusion, of torture, of atrocities being committed, 34 massacres just in 1 year. And the current government's response to this UN report was to accuse it of bias, of interfering in sovereignty, of talking rubbish, and that's the kind of climate that people are operating in Colombia. I know I'm running out of time. I just think it's important, to say, I think Colombia isn't in a vacuum, and the region and what's happening in Venezuela obviously affects the process in Colombia. The last, my role when I was advising the FARC was to liaise with the international community, and particularly with the UN Security Council. And the last time I went, just a year ago, to speak to members of the Security Council, I really saw a shift in the fact that now the situation in Venezuela is, used to also kind of lessen the pressure on Colombia, because Colombia's positioned itself as the democracy, the face of democracy in Latin America and the aggressor to Venezuela. So all of that has affected how much pressure is on the Colombian administration to implement the peace agreement. I know I've presented quite a bleak picture, and I think it's important to still have hope. And it might be hard to, but I think we owe it also to all those people struggling in Colombia to have hope. There's many people organising, there's been huge strikes and massive protests and demonstrations in the last few months. And there's also a really interesting process of kind of opposition coming together, people from very different broad political sectors coming together to defend a peace agreement. So I think it's important to build that support and to not lose hope, and to see that the agreement is a roadmap, and with a different government we could come back to that hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariella. There is clearly a good deal more that could be said about the Colombian peace process, and if you want to hear some of that, there is a meeting to be held at the TUC premises on March the 17th at 6:30. I'll just leave that there for anyone who wants to pick up those details. Our next speaker, and I've lost my notes because my phone's closed down. Our next speaker comes to us from King's College London, where he is the Professor of Political Economy and International Development. He is Alfredo Saad-Filho. He has worked extensively at SOAS in a number of academic capacities, but he has also he's taught in universities and in research departments in a very large number of countries. So he's clearly got a significant amount of international experience in Brazil, in Canada, in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, in Mozambique, Switzerland, and of course here in the UK. And like many of the people who do sterling academic work, he has been the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award, of which I'm sure he's very proud, and we're proud that he has managed to achieve that. So the floor is yours, Alfredo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you to Pablo for the invitation to be here tonight. I was asked to comment on the challenges faced by progressive forces in Latin America, and my conclusion is going to be pessimistic for three reasons. The first is that Latin America has always been characterized by social exclusion and vast inequalities of income, wealth, and privilege, and this was the case historically and continues to be the case now. Second is that Latin American states were created to maintain the principles of social exclusion and pitiless exploitation of nature and exploitation of the majority of the population, including over time the native population, slaves, poor immigrants, peasants, formal and informal workers. And those states tend to respond vigorously when inequality and privilege are challenged from below. But they tend to react only weakly when the rules of the game are challenged by sections of the elite. And the consequence has often been that policies across the region are at the same time inconsistent, volatile, and heavy-handed. Third problem is that Latin American states have always played an essential role in social engineering across the region, usually as part of the promotion of selected types of economic activities and strategies. But the conflicts and divisions within the elite have very often limited the efficacy of those policies and led to the adoption of inconsistent development strategies. And this is important because I want to suggest to you today that Latin America has not changed very much, and that the challenges that are faced by progressive forces today are basically what they have always been in the past. That's my first point. My next point is about the transition to neoliberalism in Latin America. And we know that Latin America was one of the first regions in the world to turn to neoliberalism. The first wave of neoliberal reform in Latin America started with the coup in Chile in 1973, and it was followed by the dictatorships in Argentina and in Uruguay. Those experiences ended very badly in the 1980s with very severe deindustrialization, capital flight, very large foreign debts, and deep economic crises. But there was a second wave of transition to neoliberalism across the region that was associated with the stabilization of the inflationary crises that were very common in Latin America in the 1980s, and with transitions from dictatorship to democracy. Remember that in the late 1970s, very few Latin American countries were democracies. 10 years later, basically all of them were not only political democracies, they were neoliberal democracies. And across Latin America, political democracy then became a tool legitimizing and supporting neoliberalism. Now, the economic changes associated with neoliberalism were achieved. They included the financialization and the global integration of production, the restructuring of the manufacturing sector that had been built under import substituting industrialization, the transformation of those economies towards low-tech, low-wage urban services, together with a very powerful agribusiness and mineral base that does not create jobs. And then across the region in the early 2000s, we see the election of what in Europe would be recognized as moderate social democratic or third wayist administrations committed to neoliberalism in the economic domain, but also trying to achieve some form of redistribution in the social domain. And those administrations became known collectively as the Pink Tide. Now, throughout the 2000s, Latin America surfed the wave of the global commodity boom, and the Pink Tide administrations used the proceeds of the boom to distribute income and to build the infrastructure of welfare states in the most unequal region in the world. And they were so successful that Latin America was the only region in the world where the distribution of income improved in the 2000s. Improved at the margin, but it did improve. But with the global crisis that started in 2008 and then the end of the global commodity boom in 2011, Latin America fell into economic stagnation. The resources to build welfare states and to fund social transfers declined, and it became clear that the Pink Tide had actually achieved very little. It had distributed more equally the proceeds of the boom, but very little infrastructure had been built, and although many poor people gained higher wages and some access to benefits and to bank credit, they could now buy consumer goods, a lot of them made in China, not made in Latin America. Those people would still live in neighborhoods without decent transport or schools or doctors or water or sewage, and with a lot of violence both outside the home and inside the home too. Now, perception that the conditions of life had not changed very much fed frustration with the Pink Tide, and at the same time, the social and economic consequences of neoliberalism remained unchallenged because most Pink Tide governments made a point of not challenging neoliberalism directly. And because of their moderation and their commitment to neoliberalism, those governments by and large did not reform the media, did not distribute land. They tolerated industrial action but did not expand the power of the trade unions and did not increase the influence of the workers in the workplace. So across the region we find then that the political right, internationalized capital, the upper middle class, they did not like their marginalization from power because of the rise of new social groups associated with the left parties of the Pink Tide and those administrations that they led. The right and internationalized capital came on the attack, and they used two main tools. One was external pressure, especially in the small countries, and the other was mobilization around the failures of the Pink Tide governments to improve living conditions and around corruption. And those lines of attack were devastatingly effective. Today, most of the region is in the hands of more or less authoritarian right-wing governments with a renewed neoliberalism in economic policy and much greater US influence almost everywhere. What we can learn as progressive forces from those experiences in Latin America, three things, and I'll conclude on this. The first is that neoliberalism is not just limited to ideology or to policy choice. Neoliberalism has a material basis and for this reason it cannot be rejected simply by voting for something else. Second is that achieving democratic goals in the economy and in the political system requires high economic growth rates than those that were experienced under neoliberalism and under the pink tide, but this is insufficient. Democratic reforms also need a structural shift in the economic strategy and the transformation of the social and political conditions that underpin the process of growth. Third is the problem of alternatives, because we cannot simply say no to what exists. Mobilization and trust only come together around a positive program, something to aim for, not just something that we don't like. So the biggest challenge for the left in Latin America, as in other regions right now, is to create those hopes, to create those movements, to create those conditions of struggle. Without them, we are disarmed, but with them, we can think about changing the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. Well, the situation may be bleak, but at least you offer us the possibility of organising to change the world. Thank you very much for those remarks. Our next speaker is Matias Orellana. Matias became the symbol of resistance after losing an eye to police violence in the current Chile protests against the Piñera government. He will talk about his own experiences and give us an insider's account of the movement for greater democracy. He will be introduced and translated by Paulo Grayling, who is a member of the Asamblea Chilena in Londres, the Chilean Assembly in London. The floor is yours, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here speaking on behalf of Asamblea Chilena. First of all, I'd like to thank Pablo for working with us to bring Matias. So I am going to briefly introduce the Asamblea. So we are a very recent creation. We came here in response to the events in Chile. A group of Chilean residents in London, we were horrified by the repression of the movement sparked by the October 18th strike. So we came together to denounce human rights violations in Chile and to support the protest movement. We are very much aware that, as all the panelists before us have said, the roots of the crisis in Chile are deep. And in Chile in particular, there will be no peace and no solution until we have a new constitution. That will not be the solution, but that could be a start. So Asamblea Chilena is committed to defending human rights in Chile, but also to campaigning for a new constitution in Chile and a constitutive assembly. And we are glad to be hosting Matias Orellana, who's come from Chile, and he will be able to explain to all of us in his own words, through his personal experience and what he has seen in Chile, what the reality that our people is facing. Thank you very much.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Primero que nada, agradecer a las personas que hacen posible este encuentro, que hicieron posible también que yo esté acá en este país, y a los que me han recibido en su casa o a los que nos han mostrado la ciudad, que hacen que esta visita sea súper linda.
First of all, thank you to everybody who helped me come here. I am very grateful for the people who have received us and helped us travel here and helped us made us visit this city. To everybody who has made that this has been a lovely experience.
Me gustaría, y bueno, el motivo también de mi viaje por estos lados es contar mi testimonio como víctima de terrorismo de Estado.
The reason of my trip to Europe is to tell my experience as a victim of state terrorism.
Y que ojalá se pueda hacer algún tipo de preguntas para de repente desmitificar algunas cosas que ustedes puedan creer a la distancia, y que yo les pueda dar una opinión, bueno, mía, pero quizás más cercana a la realidad que a la distancia.
I will be very glad to be taking questions to maybe enable a better understanding of what the reality of state violence and state terrorism is in Chile, as I can draw from my personal experience, but also from what I've directly observed in Chile.
Como conversaron las personas anteriormente, lo que está sucediendo en Chile responde también a una crisis que desencadena de un modelo económico que es el modelo neoliberal. Hay que partir desde esa premisa, modelo que fue instaurado en una dictadura y cuya constitución aún está vigente en nuestro país.
As the previous panelists have said, the crisis in Chile has its roots in the neoliberal model, a neoliberal model that was built into our economy, our society, and our constitution, that was written and that was drafted under Pinochet, and is the constitution under which we are still living.
Bueno, las consecuencias de este sistema básicamente son la privatización de la mayoría de todo, incluidos los derechos sociales, los servicios básicos, y que tuvo al principio una cara muy violenta y que durante todo el tiempo en que ha estado este sistema económico, la represión ha sido fundamental y ha sido como uno de los pilares, por lo que veo en todos los países de Latinoamérica, en donde llegó.
This system is based on private property of everything, but essentially on private property of basic goods like water and power, but also for social services. And it is a system that has maintained itself through violence, at first through open violence, and then under the transition government with a certain of soft or undercover violence, but that violence is also something that has permeated the whole continent.
También en los últimos meses, desde que empezó el estallido social, se ha intentado, para mí, reducir la explicación de lo que está sucediendo a los últimos 30 años de los gobiernos de transición de la democracia, pero para mí sería súper importante poner en la mesa que la historia desde la colonia siempre ha sido violenta y siempre ha sido el pueblo chileno, primero los indígenas y luego mestizos, siempre han sido sometidos por fuerzas extranjeras.
Over the last months, the reasons for the crisis have often been reduced to what's been happening over the last 30 years in the democratic transition period, but I would like to explain also that violence has always been present in Chile. It was present since the colonization of the country. That was a brutal takeover over the indigenous people, and it was then present in the treatment that was met to the mestizo population that came afterwards. And the story of the Chilean Republic is a story of power and domination and violence.
Entonces siempre ha estado este poder económico que ha estado sobre nosotros, sobre la clase trabajadora, y siempre ha sido la fuerza y la violencia la forma de operar de la clase dominante. Primero, y si vemos hasta muy avanzado el siglo XX ya tenemos las últimas matanzas como la matanza de Ranquil, la matanza de la Escuela Santa María, que claro, en un principio fueron los indígenas, después fueron trabajadores organizados los que morían, y hoy en día, como las circunstancias han cambiado un poco, son los ciudadanos comunes los que están pagando con su vida, y bueno, y en mi caso y de muchos más fue con sus ojos.
In Chile, the dominant classes have always kept control of the country using violence over the working classes, and that was demonstrated by the big massacres that happened in the Chilean history, like the massacre of Ranqui, the massacre of Santa Maria de Iquique. In both cases, workers were protesting and asking for better work conditions and better salaries were massacred without any pity. Nowadays, in Chile, we see again a resurgence of this. Well, obviously, there was the period of the coup, and now we see again people being killed in response to social protest, or people being mutilated like myself.
Bueno, yo participé casi de todas las protestas desde que comenzaron. Me mantuve en la calle, yendo a la mayoría de las manifestaciones.
I participated to most protests since the beginning. I spent a lot of time in the streets, and I've been at most demonstrations.
Y sabíamos que en Año Nuevo iba a ser una fecha complicada porque no había muchos ánimos de celebrar en Chile y también sabíamos que los carabineros van a estar esperando cualquier posibilidad para reprimir.
We expected trouble for the new year because nobody was really in a celebratory mood, and we knew that the police was waiting for a pretext to unleash repression.
Entonces yo siempre pensé no salir esa noche para tener cuidado y para prevenir cualquier accidente, pero bueno, las circunstancias durante la noche cambiaron y era la despedida de un amigo también, entonces decidí salir y fuimos a Valparaíso.
I hadn't planned to go out at night to avoid trouble, but things changed, and we went to Valparaíso because it was the birthday of a friend. ¿La despedida?
Sí.
We were saying farewell to a friend.
Y para llegar al lugar donde nosotros íbamos teníamos que pasar sí o sí por un lugar que estaba lleno de policías y que después al pasar por la plaza nos dimos cuenta que había enfrentamientos entre manifestantes y policías.
So to reach our destination we had to cross an area where there was a big concentration of police forces, and when we got to the square we realized there was a big confrontation, a big fight between police forces and demonstrators.
Estaba totalmente lleno de humo, en verdad, de gases lacrimógenos, y estaba el guanaco también tirándole agua a los manifestantes. Entonces la plaza completa estaba como cubierta de humo y era casi imposible pasar. Nosotros nos quedamos esperando harto rato y luego decidimos pasar corriendo porque era la única forma de pasar por ese sector.
The square was full of tear gas, and the water cannons were throwing water all over the place, and it was almost impossible to cross. So we waited for quite a while, hoping that it will calm down and we'll be able to cross normally, but it wasn't possible, so we decided to make a run for it.
Es importante mencionar que el modus operandi de la policía siempre ha sido mayoritariamente el uso indiscriminado de bombas lacrimógenas, incluso bombas lacrimógenas vencidas, y hay un montón de gente en Chile que incluso tiene grandes colecciones de estas bombas que pareciera que fuera un arsenal de guerra y son recolectadas en tan solo una tarde.
The Chilean police has had a policy of using huge amounts of tear gas. They also have been using tear gas canisters that are out of date, meaning their toxicity and their lethality can be much higher or is unknown. And they use a great amount of these munitions, so much that sometimes you can see huge piles of burnt out canisters that look like a war just happened, but those are just the canisters that have been collected in one afternoon or one evening.
Bueno, cuando nosotros pasamos, subimos un poco el cerro en Valparaíso, unos 200 metros, y nos quedamos observando desde ahí la manifestación, donde comenzaban todo el tiempo a haber nuevas formas de represión. Pues. Luego avanzó un poco, subió un grado más la policía y comenzaron a disparar perdigones, que son unos perdigones de 80% acero o plomo y 20% goma, y que suelen dispararlos también y hacen uso indiscriminado de eso.
So we managed to cross the square, and we started up the hill. Valparaíso is built on hills. So we started up the hill, and we must have progressed some 200 meters when the police repression went 1 degree up. So they started using rubber bullets. Rubber bullets are not really rubber. They're metal bullets that are coated with rubber and that are still extremely dangerous and can be lethal.
En un momento los carabineros comienzan a retroceder y los manifestantes empiezan a avanzar a tal punto que la plaza queda completamente despejada de carabineros con los manifestantes manteniendo la distancia y aguantando la represión desde cada vez más atrás.
There was a moment when the police have advanced and the demonstrators started moving back. Right to a point where the square was empty of demonstrators, and the demonstrators were trying to hold the police back at a distance.
En ese momento uno de mis amigos baja a la plaza y se pone con la finalidad de mirar de más cerca. Estaba sacando algunas fotos con el teléfono, me acuerdo, y yo decidí bajar a buscarlo porque según mi criterio, él estaba ya muy cerca como de los manifestantes. En ese momento yo bajo y nos dimos cuenta que estábamos justo en línea de fuego desde donde estaban disparando las bombas lacrimógenas los pacos.
One of my friends decided to move into the square to take pictures of the confrontation from a little bit closer. After a moment I got worried for him, so I went to fetch him. And as I got into the square close to him, I realized that I was in the line of fire, that we were in the line of fire, on the police line of fire.
Bueno, en ese momento, que fue todo muy rápido, recuerdo haber visto una luz como un flash muy grande y segundos después sentí el impacto de una bomba lacrimógena que me llegó en el cráneo. Estas bombas lacrimógenas se disparan con escopeta y los carabineros le han estado disparando directamente al cuerpo y yo fui una de las personas que lo recibió y bueno, recuerdo que no perdí la conciencia, entonces me acuerdo como de todo lo que ocurrió desde ahí hasta las operaciones y todo, y en el momento fue súper complejo porque fue en medio de la plaza, yo sentí mucha sangre en toda la cara, como una sangre que me ahogaba, y comencé a sentir la polera pesada y me asusté, po. Y ahí un manifestante, un capucha como le dicen, o los primera línea que también los llaman, me cargó y me llevó a una zona con menos gas lacrimógeno. Yo me acuerdo que le repetía todo el rato a las personas que estaban ahí que porfa me aplastaran el ojo por la sangre.
So after these things happened very fast, I saw a flash, and then I felt the impact, and then suddenly I was in pain. I was bleeding. I was asking for people help. I was asking them to stop the bleeding, to compress the wound. People were scared. And my memories are a bit confused, but many things happened. Somebody finally came and bandaged and compressed the wound and bandaged my eye, and I was taken into hospital where they observed the fracture, and I was operated and taken care of. Since then, and what I remember from the moment is that my t-shirt filling with blood, my t-shirt feeling heavy with blood. And then being taken away.
Recuerdo que de entre las personas que se acercaron a verme, uno me vendó el cráneo y detuvo el sangrado mientras esperábamos a la ambulancia, que nunca llegó y fue un vecino en camioneta el que me trasladó al hospital.
I remember that somebody came around and bandaged my head. We were waiting for the ambulance that never came, and in the end it was a neighbor who had a pickup truck to take me to the hospital.
Una vez que estaba en el hospital, no me atendieron al tiro y yo estaba como un poco desesperado porque sentía que era mucha la sangre, entonces tenía susto. Recién a las 7 de la mañana me ingresaron a pabellón a operarme y yo llegué al hospital a las 3 más o menos.
So once in the hospital, I wasn't received immediately. I was very scared because I felt I had lost a lot of blood. So they made me wait for a long time. I arrived at the hospital at 3 a.m. I was only taken care of at 7 a.m. So I spent 3 hours in hospital in that state.
Desde el primer momento y hasta que llegué al hospital, siempre pensé y estaba seguro de que había perdido el ojo porque es una sensación muy extraña, pero yo lo sentía. Y ese era mi convencimiento.
From the moment it happened and I arrived into the hospital, I was sure I had lost my eye. It's a very strange sensation, but I knew it. I knew I had lost the eye.
Pero cuando estaba en el hospital y me hicieron los primeros exámenes, la lesión que apareció primero fue una multifractura de cráneo expuesta, lo que fue lo que me operaron primero porque era urgente y necesitaban cerrar el cerebro, entre comillas, porque el cerebro había quedado como a la vista en algún lugar de acá.
But when they started taking care of me at the hospital, the first injury that had to be dealt with was a multiple skull fracture. They had to operate. That was the first thing they had to operate because my brain was exposed. So that was the first thing that the medical team had to deal with.
Entonces, muchos de los lesionados oculares que han recibido impactos de lacrimógena han tenido daños muy complicados en el cráneo, porque la mayoría de las veces está asociado a fracturas e incluso hay personas que aún están hospitalizadas y que incluso están en coma por el daño que tuvieron esa...
Many of the eye trauma victims are also essentially skull fracture victims. Many of them have received multiple fractures of the skull. They have situations where the brain is exposed, situations where heavy bleeding in the brain has led to comas. Many people are still hospitalized. And these are all injuries very often with very complex and difficult prognostics.
Esto tuvo por resultado que yo tuviera 3 días hospitalizado en recuperación de una primera operación, pero sabiendo que tenía un ojo muerto en el ojo y que la sensación era un poco de desesperación de querer que me lo sacaran rápido.
So in my first 3 days in the hospital, I was recuperating from this first operation, but I felt desperate because I also knew that I had a dead eye in my socket, and I wanted them to remove it.
Luego me operaron del ojo, extrajeron todo lo que tenían que extraer y pusieron un implante. Pero un mes después, cuando tuve control de esta primera operación, el médico me informó que no habían hecho la operación completa porque en el hospital no estaban todos los insumos necesarios para poner dentro del ojo todo lo que tenían que poner en esa operación.
So after that, they operated on my eye. They extracted everything that needed to be extracted, and they gave me an implant. After that, I had a control a month later, and then I was told that the operation wasn't finished because when they operated me at the hospital at the time, they didn't have all the elements they needed to complete the operation.
Bueno, después de esto viene el periodo de recuperación y de controles, etcétera, que es un proceso también que es súper complicado para todas las víctimas de trauma ocular, porque la decisión del gobierno central es atender a todas las personas en Santiago. Entonces, independientemente de la región donde tú vivas, tienes que trasladarte muchos kilómetros hasta el hospital El Salvador.
After that came the recuperation period, which is quite complex because all the controls and the operations happen in Santiago. The government decided to centralize the treatment of all the injured people in Santiago, which means that if you live far away, you have to travel to Santiago, which in Chile can mean that you have to travel thousands of kilometers sometimes to get your healthcare treatment.
Bueno, entonces esta es como mi historia como víctima de terrorismo de Estado, desde haber perdido un ojo, pero hay muchas personas que están viviendo otros procesos porque o fueron violados o fueron torturados o bueno, los casos de las familias de los familiares que perdieron sus vidas.
So this is my story as an eye trauma victim and as a victim of the state terrorism, but there are many other stories, like the stories of the people who have been raped or tortured in detention, and the stories of the families of the people who have been killed in the recent protests.
Y el problema principal que nace de esto ahora es que las instituciones no están funcionando y no están dando respuesta a las cosas que han ocurrido. No está habiendo ni justicia, no se están dando bien los servicios de salud y día a día la represión sigue y semana por semana son más las víctimas de pérdida de su ojo o son más las víctimas de tortura y cada día son más los presos que ni siquiera están siendo tratados como presos políticos, sino que están siendo tratados como presos comunes.
And the situation we're facing now is one that in which the justice is not working. Cases, the judiciary system is not working. It's not protecting the victims. It's not persecuting the perpetrators. The health system is not working. It's not giving proper care. It's not giving proper support to victims. And the repression continues, and more people are being hurt. And this is not over, and it's not finishing anytime soon. The repression carries on, and
Entonces la invitación que le hago a seguir, continuar siguiendo lo que pasa en Chile, intentar compartir la información para romper el cerco mediático del que también somos parte, que no permite que toda la información llegue acá. Sí.
So I ask you to help us break the silence. Help us raise awareness of what's happening in Chile and make sure that the information comes out of the country. we need that support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matias and Paolo, for the translation. Our final speaker from the panel is Pablo Navarrete, whom I'm sure many of you know. If you know anything about Alborada, you will certainly know that he's the co-editor. He is a prolific journalist and filmmaker, and he is a British Chilean. And the floor is yours, Pablo.
Thank you, Christine. Firstly, I'd like to just say how happy I am but to be sharing a panel with such the people who I have such respect for, and listening to Matias's account, you know, it's really hard to hear the levels of brutality that the Chilean state has been inflicting on its citizens. My parents are Chilean. They left in the 70s after the coup. They both spent time in concentration camps and torture centres, and there are many other people here who are also sons and daughters of people who were tortured and you know, subjected to all manner of injustice under the Pinochet dictatorship. And I think it's really important to emphasize and to make very explicit that this violence that is being enacted on the citizens of Chile today, the mutilations, the tortures, the rapes by the state forces, state terrorism, as Matias has correctly described, is something that began with the birth of neoliberalism, arguably in the world, which took place in Chile, and that this violence is intrinsic to neoliberalism, even though, you know, you had these foreign middle-class, upper-class Chileans who studied in Chicago, in the best Ivy League universities, who said they were learning about a new revolution in economics. When the coup happened, these were the people that were tasked with redesigning the economy. And even though these very educated, metropolitan types would be the first to say that they were horrified by the butchery, the sort of medieval levels of torture that were inflicted on Chileans with US government training, of course. They were very much the flip side and an intrinsic component of what neoliberalism was in its birth and continues to be today in Chile and in other parts of Latin America and the world. And I think we live in a world where the media, the sort of dominant media narratives, corporate media and state-sponsored or funded Western media, chooses its villains and its enemies in a manner that shows a very, very high correlation with the interests of these right-wing neoliberal governments in places such as the US, in Britain. It's no coincidence, I think, that Piñera would be a friend of Boris Johnson, that Piñera would be a friend of Donald Trump, that Ivan Duque is a friend of Piñera, that Ivan Duque is a friend of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, and that we hear relatively little about the mutilations taking place in Chile, but that we hear a lot about the very real difficulties being experienced by Venezuelans today. We also hear very little about the embargo by the US that has conditioned that reality in Venezuela to a large degree. We even hear very little in the UK about the billions of pounds of Venezuelan gold that has been stolen by the Bank of England, but we hear about the difficulties being experienced in Venezuela. So there is this very uncomfortable, corrupt relationship between the media and what they choose to highlight, and the interests of governments, such as right-wing governments in places such as the UK and the US. And this media, I would argue, is not just about right-wing reactionary media that we would expect to be perhaps show a bias to sort of the right. I would say that this dereliction of duty amongst journalists and media organizations goes across the sort of so-called political spectrum, and it's something that's been going on for a long time with regards to Venezuela. It's the reason why you would have heard of all manner of alleged injustices that have taken place since under Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, but you've heard relatively little about the 600 or so people that have been murdered only since the signing of the peace agreement, about people being killed with chainsaws in Colombia and handed over to their families in black plastic bags by governments that are funded to the tune of billions by the US government, that receive secret UK military funding. So this disconnect is extremely troubling, worrying. It should trouble us as citizens. And I think it points to a kind of subservience amongst the media class in places such as Britain, which really affects the democratic outcomes of people in Chile. And I think, therefore, the role of independent media takes on a new importance. I think in the case of this kind of vilification that we have seen with certain enemies of the West, we saw a little bit in the UK in the last 4 or 5 years in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, how a media class can enact such sort of sustained levels of propaganda that they can turn certain people, they can make people really kind of have intense feelings towards a certain person. And I think for the thing that I, for example, the thing that I realized with regards to, say, Venezuela, maybe 10 years ago after living there, I think perhaps some people are realizing now how when the stakes are high in the political arena, media organizations decide to take sides, and this, you know, and this is most often than not on the case of the right. So independent media becomes really important. In Chile, I was just back from a 10-day trip filming, and I went to visit El Canal 3 de la Victoria in a sort of the outskirts of Santiago, who have been at the forefront of kind of exposing this brutality when the Chilean media have been, again, relatively silent. And the other sort of organizations that take on a really important role are trade union organizations. In the case of the UK, the work that Mariela did for Justice for Colombia, these were the organizations that were chronicling the butchery of Colombian people when the British media was deciding to concentrate all its media coverage on, you know, whatever injustice they felt Chavez had done that day. So we need to look at ways to build independent media in the face of an intransigent media class that refuse to honestly cover events in good faith and give proper balance to events. You know, the same media that turned Evo Morales into a dictator. And this is not to say that there aren't legitimate debates that left-wing and progressive people could and should be having around left-wing governments, because they should be. But the point is, the polarization of the right around these issues means that people on the left end up having to defend such basic facts that they do an injustice to the ability of all of us to have the important debates that progressives should be having. So we need to support independent media. We need to call out, I think, some of this sort of these corporate biased media narratives. And I think in the case of Chile, I think it's also interesting, and this is not really related to the media, I think it's just an observation of having returned from Chile, a country that I don't know very well. In reality, I've born here, have been 4 times in my life, for short periods of time. But I think there is hope. I mean, in the last year, I've been to Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, and now Chile, filming with people who are resisting in multiple ways, who are not willing to accept the sort of tyranny of neoliberalism. So I do feel optimistic, even though the panorama can seem quite pessimistic. In Chile, certainly there is a massive level of energy and optimism and anger. And I think that in Chile, really, the country where neoliberalism was born with this intense level of violence, which carries on and has carried on, as Matias says, from time even before the dictatorship, since the Chilean state was born. But it's certainly a normalization of violence, which is not healthy and shouldn't be acceptable in any type of decent society. So I think Chile today stands at this kind of crucial moment where the people in the streets, who in many ways do reject a discredited political class of all types, of the left, of the right, the so-called left, and that's a legitimate perspective. And we, I think, as progressives, need to support the people in the street and think about the strategies for social change as well, and how we can build media and confront narratives and the practice of the right in Latin America and beyond.
Pablo, thank you very much. I think there's the clear message about the need for independent media is just so obvious when we look at everything that we're subject to from the traditional media. We've got about